Good evening, I'm David Kramer with Alaska Weather. As always, please visit our website, weather.gov/Alaska. You can get updates to our forecast or check out any watches, warnings, or advisories that we might have out for your area. You can also call our weather info line at 1-800-472-0391. Get any updates to the forecast through that means as well. And you can email me at the address at the bottom of the screen, david.kramer@noaa.gov. We'll start off with a quick look at our climate. Now this is focused on Fairbanks, and this is for last month, so for June of 2020. You can see for temperatures, we were pretty close to averages with our observed for our average max temperature being right around 70 degrees, our average min temperature being right around 50 degrees or just below 50 degrees, and then the average mean temperature being right around 60 degrees. However, as we look at how much rain actually fell, we'll see quite a difference. The observed amount was over 3 inches. Again, this is for the Fairbanks area for June. And the actual normal amount is 1.37. So we had over double the amount of normal rain for June, which we could see in a lot of the flood products that we had out and a lot of flooding of the rivers around the area, especially around the Fairbanks area. So one of the things that we set yesterday was for July 1st, we set a new record for the high temperature up to 78. The previous record was 77 degrees in 1989, so we did break that with 78 degrees. And then as we look at our outlook, so the map is focused on the Fairbanks area where you can see the stars, so the equal chances for normal, above normal, and below normal temperatures and precipitation that's stated at the bottom of the screen is focused on the Fairbanks area. However, as we look at the map, starting with the map on the left with the areas of green, that's the precipitation map, and we can see along much of the west coast and Arctic coastline there are above chances for above normal precipitation along the west coast and Arctic coastline and for the Aleutian Islands. Then as we look at the image on the right that has the red or orange color, that's the temperature one, and we can see that all along the North Gulf Coast, to include the Panhandle and Alaska Peninsula, we're looking at above chances for, or higher than average chances for above normal temperatures. So we're looking at highest likelihood of being above normal temperatures. And then as we look along the northwest coast of the state, we can see again there's above average chances of getting above normal temperatures. Taking a look now at our fire danger, we do have a high likelihood of fire danger for the upper Yukon Valley, and then in southeastern portions of the Copper River Basin, and for the west coast and some of the interior locations for the Kenai Peninsula. As we look down into the southeastern portion of the state, we're actually going to zoom in here. So this is red flag warning criteria where we have for our map there is focused on the northern portions of the Panhandle area, specifically around Lynn Canal and those northern places of Lynn Canal as we get up by Haines and Skagway and into White Pass area. We do have some red flag conditions in effect. This is through today until 8 p.m. this evening. Red flag warnings, meaning that we have low relative humidity, higher winds, warm temperatures, and dry fuels. So we are looking at potential for some heavy fire danger in these areas. Again, that's for upper portions of the Lynn Canal area extending up through Haines, Skagway, and White Pass. We do have the red flag warning out until 8 p.m. this evening on Thursday. Taking a look now at our satellite imagery, we'll start off with the lingering system that we have over the west coast that's pushing further into mainland Alaska. You can see it's kind of breaking down now, but we can still see quite a bit of cloud cover, bringing rain to these areas. Watching this again, we can see portions of that extending down into the Alaska Peninsula as well with that cloud cover, bringing rain to these areas. And then we'll watch this loop again. We'll focus further out west by the western Aleutian Islands where we have another system coming in. You can start to see some of that cloud cover creeping in to the south of the western Aleutian Islands. Going to be the next factor for those areas, bringing more rain to the area. And as we look down in the Panhandle area, you can see the cloud cover sitting out over southern portions of the Panhandle, but pretty clear and dry out for those northern locations, helping to aid in those higher temperatures and lower relative humidities. As we look for the weather for the remainder of today, let's stay out over the Panhandle area where we have low pressure just to the south of the area, bringing rain to southern locations. But as we get further to the north, we are seeing that a little bit drier, where we are seeing some of that warmer air in the area, resulting in those higher temperatures. And as we look out over mainland Alaska, that system that's breaking apart over the west coast, pushing rain into the Kotzebue Sound area, where we're starting to mix with fog in that area as well, extending up by Point Hope and Point Lay. We have some of that rain extending into southern portions of the interior as well as into the Alaska range. And then we have that rain extending down through southwest Alaska, through the Bristol Bay area, through the Alaska Peninsula, and eastern Aleutian Islands. Getting stuck up by that high pressure that's sitting out there south of Kodiak Island, extending that ridging out over the Kodiak Island area. As we look further to the west, we have another system coming up from the North Pacific that's moving towards the western Aleutian Islands, bringing another round of rain to the area. Looking into tonight, that system is going to start to push into the western part of the Bering Sea, extending its front further into the western Aleutian Islands, bringing rain to the area. As we look further to the east, we have rain still hanging out by the eastern Aleutians, extending into the Alaska Peninsula, riding over top of that ridging that we see south of the Kodiak Island area. And that off of that former boundary that we have today, we are still seeing rain extending out over the Bristol Bay area, mixing with fog there, extending into much of southwest Alaska, all along the west coast of the state into the western interior, some locations around the Alaska range as well, then up to the northwestern portions of the state. We also have some fog up along the central locations of the Arctic coast, as well as a mixture of rain and fog as we get further to the east along the Arctic coastline. Much of south central that's not in the mountains should be pretty clear of precipitation for tonight, and that's going to extend down the Gulf Coast into the Panhandle area, where we just have some lingering showers out in the very southern locations by Hyder area. As we move into Friday, going to continue to see showers in the Hyder area. Much of the rest of the Panhandle should be pretty clear. And then as we move along the North Gulf Coast, going to continue to see places pretty dry until we get into the western portions of South Central, especially as we get into the Alaska Range and the Talkeetna Mountains. That rain is going to extend up into central and western portions of the interior, then down into southwestern portions of the state, up much of the west coast, and into northwest Alaska as well. However, high pressure over the Arctic coastline is going to keep the area, or going to keep the precipitation off to the east and to the south. As we drop down into the Bering Sea, we can see our frontal system pushing further into the western portions of the Bering Sea, front slowly moving through the western Aleutians, closer towards the central Aleutian Islands, bringing rain to both areas, and some of those rain showers out ahead of this system going to extend into the eastern Aleutians, Pribilof Islands, and Alaska Peninsula. As we move into Saturday, that system in the more northern places of the western Bering, extending its front through the central Bering Sea and central Aleutian Islands, bringing rain with it. Behind the frontal system, we do have some areas of showers for the western Aleutian Islands, and then out ahead of the system, we have another area of showers for the eastern Aleutians, Pribilof Islands, Alaska Peninsula, up much of the southwestern coastline. However, the remainder of the western portions of mainland Alaska are going to finally dry up, and we're going to have more dominant high pressure along the Arctic coastline. Down the east coast of mainland Alaska, we are going to see some showers, and that's going to extend south into the Alaska Range and Talkeetna Mountains and areas of Wrangell St. Elias. And as we drop down into southeast Alaska, most of the area should be pretty clear, but as we move up a little bit further to the north, just out of our area, we will see some rain showers out over northwestern Canada. Taking a look at our temperatures starting Friday morning for the southeastern portions of the state, we do have temperatures dropping down into the lower 50s for the Panhandle. And then for south central Alaska, dropping down to right around 50 degrees, a little bit warmer by the water. As you move up into the interior, dropping down to the upper 40s, and then right around 50 degrees for western portions of the interior, 52 at Galena. As we move up along the Arctic coastline from Utqiagvik and areas further to the east, dropping down into the mid-30s and dropping down into the 40s for the west coast of the Arctic coastline. Down the west coast of the state, dropping down into the 40s for the most part. Gamble dropping down to 40 degrees. Southwestern portions of the state, mid to upper 40s for the YK Delta and in the lower 50s for the Bristol Bay area. Down in the Alaska Peninsula, dropping down to around 40 or around 50 degrees with the mid 40s for the Aleutians. Friday afternoon highs staying right around 50 degrees for those highs for the Aleutian Islands, into the mid-60s for areas of the Bristol Bay area, mid to upper 50s for the YK Delta area. And we're going to see those temperatures rise as we move further into mainland Alaska, into the mid-60s for some of the locations in the western part of the interior, but as we get into central and eastern portions of the interior, getting up into right around 70 degrees, or for Fort Yukon up to 74 degrees. Up along the Arctic coastline, we are going to see temperatures in eastern locations in the 40s, western locations in the 50s. Down in south central Alaska, seeing many temperatures, especially in more interior locations, getting up into the mid 70s, with some locations near the water only getting up into the mid 60s. Seward's going to get a little bit warmer there, 76 degrees. And then down in the Panhandle area, southern locations that are going to stay under that cloud cover only going to get up into the lower 60s, whereas northern locations out of that cloud cover are going to get up to around 70 degrees. As we move into Saturday morning, we are going to have temperatures drop back down to around 50 degrees for the Panhandle, into the mid 50s for much of south central Alaska, some locations dropping down into the 40s, right around 50 degrees for many locations in the interior, and then as we get along the Arctic coastline, dropping down into the 30s for the eastern locations, right around 40 for the west. Along the west coast of the state for the Seward Peninsula area, mid 40s are expected, right around 50 degrees to those upper 40s for much of southwest Alaska, and then into the mid 40s for the Aleutians. Saturday afternoon, getting back up to around 50 degrees for the Aleutian Islands, into 70s for southwest Alaska, extending into mainland Alaska to include the interior and much of south central Alaska. Stay in the 40s for the east coast of the Arctic coastline, but as we drop all the way down to the Panhandle area, expecting temperatures to get into the mid 60s for more interior locations, along the water getting up into the upper 50s.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
For aviation, we'll start off with a look at our flying weather on Friday morning. Out over much of the Bering Sea and extending into the west coast of the state, some places into the western portions of the interior, we have some IFR conditions. However, as we get further to the east into central interior, down into south central Alaska and places further east, primarily VFR conditions are expected. Up along the Arctic coastline, however, there is going to be some lingering IFR conditions right along the coast. And then way down in the Panhandle and southern portions, we are expecting some areas of NVFR and IFR conditions. Moving into Friday afternoon, we're going to notice a switch where we're diminishing some of those IFR conditions in the western portion of the state. This is happening as our system that's pushing in over the west coast is starting to diminish. So we are going to expect those IFR conditions to drop down to NVFR conditions for much of the west coast. However, out over the Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands, expecting the IFR conditions to continue and some NVFR conditions up along the Arctic coastline. Out in the very southern portions of the Panhandle, we do have some areas still lingering of the MVFR, but diminished from what we'll see Friday morning. As we move into Saturday morning, MVFR and IFR conditions returning to the Panhandle area, extending up through the central and southern portions of the area. Out over southwest Alaska, we're expecting some MVFR conditions to push in, covering much of the Alaska range and down into the Talkeetna Mountains as well. Much of the rest of mainland Alaska will be VFR until we get along the coastlines where we're expecting continued MVFR conditions with a chance of IFR conditions as well. And then down in the Bering and Aleutians, continuing to see the IFR conditions. Into Saturday afternoon, a lot of those MVFR conditions throughout mainland Alaska are going to clear up. The exception is going to be some of the mountain ranges and along the coastline where we will see continued MVFR and IFR conditions along the coast. Bering Sea and Aleutians going to continue to be in IFR conditions, and then MVFR for much of the Panhandle area, extending up some of the North Gulf coastline towards the Yakutat area. Looking through the passes, starting up North Anaktuvuk Pass should be VFR for Friday, as well as Adigan. As we drop down into the Alaska range, expecting IFR conditions improving to MVFR conditions for Lake Clark and Merrill, and then MVFR conditions throughout the day on Friday for Rainy Pass. Windy Pass should be VFR dropping down to marginal in the afternoon, whereas Isabel Pass will be VFR throughout the day as well as at Mentasta Pass. Down in Dehne, expecting VFR conditions throughout the day, and for Portage, expecting those VFR conditions as well. Chilkoot and White both expected to be VFR throughout the day on Friday. Taking a look at our freezing levels, we have our surface freezing line just off the Arctic coastline with an area of colder air with a low pressure aloft out by the northeastern portions of the state, bringing freezing levels down to 4,000 feet. We have some warmer air coming into the Gulf of Alaska with freezing levels getting to as high as 12,000 feet, and then up to as high as 14,000 feet as we get by the central and western Aleutians. For our icing, not a lot is expected. We do have some areas of icing above 10,000 feet for the northeastern portions of the state in that eastern portion of the upper Yukon Valley and eastern Brooks Range. As we look at our jet stream, we'll start off in the west with some of the stronger portions of the jet. 90 knots dropping down to 70 knots out of a westerly direction for the western Aleutians. Westerly direction around 50 knots for the Alaska Peninsula. 60 knots out of a westerly direction for southwest Alaska. 60 knots continuing out of that westerly direction for south central Alaska. Up to as high as 65 knots for the eastern portions of the state. Out of the south at 100 knots just to the east of the northeastern portions of mainland Alaska. And then moving into the Panhandle area, around 50 to 60 knots for most of the area out of a northwesterly direction, getting as high as 75 knots just off the more southern locations. Dropping down to 9,000 feet, weaker winds for the Panhandle area, northerly winds up to as high as 20 knots for southern locations. Out over the northeastern portion of the state, one of the strongest areas, northerly winds 40 knots becoming westerly as we move to the south of the Brooks Range. Out over south central Alaska, westerly winds 25 knots, getting as high as 30 knots as we get out over southwest Alaska and the eastern portions of the Bering Sea. And then out over the central and western Aleutian Islands, southwesterly winds 35 to 40 knots. Dropping down to 3,000 feet, we do have continued westerly winds over the western Aleutians, 25 knots, getting stronger and becoming more southerly up to as high as 40 knots for the central Aleutians. Eastern Aleutians seeing southerly winds 35 knots. Dropping down quite a bit over mainland Alaska, not a lot of stronger winds. Moving through the Barren Islands area, northwesterly winds 25 knots is expected, and then a weaker area of around 20 knots for the eastern portions of the interior out of a westerly direction. And just to the east of Kaktovik, we are seeing northerly winds of 45 knots. For our turbulence, not a lot expected with a lot of those weaker winds over mainland Alaska. Just an area out over the central Aleutian Islands below 3,000 feet is expected.
Hey there, stargazers. Trace here to help you glimpse the penumbral lunar eclipse passing over North America this week on Independence Day. This will be a penumbral lunar eclipse, meaning the moon will slide into Earth's shadow. Here's what you'll see from the eastern seaboard. Around 11:30 p.m., the moon will start to fall into Earth's shadow, and it will peak by 12:30 a.m. The penumbral eclipse means the moon is only getting hit by Earth's lighter outer shadow, so it won't be totally covered, but we're looking up at our own shadow. Isn't that cool? Every 6 months, Earth is treated to both solar and lunar eclipses, but timing and location is everything. In May of next year, we'll have a total lunar eclipse, but North America will get another penumbral eclipse in November. So don't miss it and keep looking up.
The beluga whale, also known as the white whale, lives in large groups and are unusual among whales. They have no dorsal fin, large bulbous heads, and they can actually swim backwards. To feed, they produce sound to find and hunt fish and invertebrates, and they use sound to communicate.
They're also known as the canaries of the sea because they make such a diversity of noises. They make chirps and whistles and gurgles and trumpeting sounds. They just make all kinds of sounds.
In the U.S., beluga whales live in the cold waters of Alaska, and there are 5 separate populations. Of those 5, the Cook Inlet population is the smallest, and has declined by about 75%. Subsistence hunting may have contributed to this initial population drop, but this practice was regulated starting in 1999, with the last hunt in 2005. Still, the beluga population here has yet to recover.
We listed Cook Inlet beluga whales as an endangered species under the Endangered Species Act in 2008, and we had hoped that the population would start recovering, but we are still seeing a continued decline. And these beluga whales are only found in Cook Inlet, and so if they go extinct, we don't think any other belugas will come back and populate this area.
These whales spend most of their summer near Anchorage, Alaska's largest city, where threats to belugas are on the rise as the city grows. These may include diminishing food, habitat loss or destruction, pollution, toxins, and human-caused noise which hampers their ability to feed and communicate. Researchers are trying to understand which of these threats may be impacting them most, but Cook Inlet is a tough place to work.
It's really hostile for research. We have the strong tides, which makes it challenging for human safety, and and we can't see through the water. It is very muddy, so we're pretty much limited to the part of the animal that breaks the surface of the water. And as a result, we have limited information about the specific population dynamics of coconut beluga whales.
Up until recently, information has mainly come from annual aerial surveys from aircraft and boat or shore-based photo identification surveys that use unique markings to tell animals apart. Scientists also use passive acoustics to listen for belugas, but none of these methods can detect much information about their health.
So it's really been a game changer with the whole species in the spotlight designation. We've gotten more resources within our agency.
For instance, we're able to use a drone to collect some aerial imagery of belugas in the wild, and we're hoping to learn some information about the age classes, information about the health status.
And probably the most important bit of information that we'll get out of that is we'll be able to identify the new calves. And we're hoping if we keep doing this every year, we'll be able to get an estimate of calf production every year that will tell us something about how well the population's doing.
We are also expanding upon our biopsy studies, hopefully to give us some information about sex, the individual's reproductive status, some genetic information, some contaminant loads.
Public and private partners are contributing as well. Some are looking at toxin levels in the whale's prey, while others are analyzing beluga teeth to learn about their age and past diet. Others monitor water quality and how belugas react to boats, and more check to see if their behavior changes with increased background noise. All of these findings will go toward developing effective recovery strategies for this population.
As for what you can do, if you're out boating, give belugas space. Don't drive right up next to them. Stay about 100 yards away. If you're flying over them, just remember that you're putting noise into the water as well, and so stay at least 1,500 feet above them. Report a stranded beluga whale as soon as possible, and that's if they're dead stranded or live stranded. The amount of information that we can learn from these animals by responding to a stranding is monumental, and it will help our efforts to recover them.
Together we can help beluga whales thrive in the dynamic waters of Cook Inlet. With continued research and good stewardship, we hope to see this population grow in the years to come.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Welcome back for the marine section. We'll start off with a look at our ice edge. You will notice that this is the ice image from yesterday, but we do have some updated information, even though we are having some technical difficulties getting the new images out to the web. We do have some easterly flow, primarily out over the Chukchi Sea area for the next couple days. That will start to push some of that ice pack in the Chukchi further to the west. And then out further east on the Arctic coastline, up by the Kaktovik area, we do have that area of open water out there with some areas of ice further to the north, and with southerly winds primarily Friday and Saturday, we are expecting some of that ice to push further to the south. Taking a look now in southeastern portions of the state for Friday, in the inside waters we have southerly winds around 10 knots. However, as we get up by Lynn Canal, we have northwesterly winds 15 knots. In the Gulf and southern locations, we have southeasterly winds 15 knots, becoming northeasterly 10 to 15 as we get into the northern parts of the Gulf. Seas as high as 7 feet, highest in the southeastern portions of the Gulf. On Saturday, out over the Gulf, continuing to see southerly winds around 10 to 15 knots for the southeastern portions of the Gulf, and then becoming more easterly as we get further to the north, 10 to 15 knots. In the inside waters, we have southerly winds 5 to 10 knots, till we get into the southern locations where westerly winds are expected around 10 knots. For Friday, for south central areas, starting off in Cook Inlet, southwesterly winds 10 to 15 knots are expected. Around the Barren Islands, westerly winds 20 to 25 knots, strongest on the eastern side of the Barren Islands. And then continuing westerly winds through much of the northern part of the Gulf of Alaska into Prince William Sound area around 15 knots, becoming northeasterly 10 knots as we get further off to the east. Then on Saturday, going to see easterly winds for the northern part of the Gulf, 10 to 15 knots, and 10 knots out of the east in Prince William Sound as well. Around the Barren Islands, westerly winds 20 knots are expected. Seas as high as 6 feet, highest on the western side of the Barren Islands. And then Cook Inlet, southwesterly winds 10 knots are expected. On Friday, for the Alaska Peninsula and Kodiak Island areas, around the island, west to southwest winds around 20 knots, becoming southerly for the Alaska Peninsula area, also around 20 knots. And then in Bristol Bay, southwesterly winds around 15 knots. For the highest seas, we're looking at the Shelikof Strait area around 6 feet. Then on Saturday, staying off by the Alaska Peninsula area, southerly winds 15 to 20 knots, strongest on the Pacific side. Bristol Bay area, southeasterly winds 10 knots are expected, and around Kodiak Island, west to southwest winds 15 to 20 knots. For the Aleutian Islands, starting off in the eastern location, southeasterly winds 20 to 25 knots, dropping down to 15 knots as we move closer towards the central Aleutians. But as we get to the central Aleutians, southerly winds at 25 knots are expected, dropping down to 20 knots by the western Aleutian Islands. Then on Saturday, west to southwest winds by the western Aleutians, 20 to 25 knots. Continuing 25 knots out of the southwest for the central Aleutians, and getting up to as high as 30 knots out of a southerly direction as we get closer towards the eastern Aleutians. But right for the eastern Aleutians, southerly winds 20 to 25 knots, strongest on the Bering side. For the west coast on Friday, southerly winds along the coast 10 knots till we get up by St. Lawrence Island area. Then it's going to be southeasterly 20 knots, dropping down for Norton Sound area around 5 knots out of the west. For St. Matthew Island area, strongest winds out of a southeasterly direction, 30 knots are expected, seas as high as 7 feet there, and then southeast winds 15 knots for the Pribilof Islands. Staying down by the Pribilof Islands, southerly winds 25 knots are expected for Saturday. Along the west coast, southeasterly winds are expected, starting off 15 knots south of Nunavik Island, getting up to as high as 20 to 25 knots further to the north, and 20 knots out of the northeast for Norton Sound, whereas at St. Matthew Island, southeasterly winds 25 knots with seas the highest there again around 9 feet. For Friday, along the Arctic coastline, we're going to see northerly winds out east around 25 knots, dropping down to 15 to 20 knots as we get further to the west and becoming more easterly. Easterly winds to the west of Wainwright at 20 knots as well, and then along the west coast, southerly winds 10 to 15 knots, getting higher through the Bering Strait, 20 knots expected there. Then on Saturday, easterly winds around the Bering Strait area, 25 knots, dropping down to 10 knots as we get to the Kotzebue Sound area. Up along the Arctic coastline, variable winds around 10 knots, and then getting up to as high as 15 knots, becoming easterly, then northerly as we get further to the east, up to as high as 25 knots near Kaktovik. For our weather recap for the remainder of tonight, we have a frontal system pushing into the western portions of the Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands, bringing rain to the area. Lingering rain hanging out over the eastern Aleutians, extending into the Alaska Peninsula up into southwest Alaska, where we'll see a mix with fog. Rain extending into western portions of the interior, down into the Alaska Range, and up through the northwestern portions of the coastline. Areas of fog going to linger around the Utqiagvik area, mixing with rain as we get by the Kaktovik area. And then down in the Panhandle area, we will expect to see primarily clearing until we get to the southern portions, especially by Haida, where we expect lingering rain showers. South Central Alaska will be primarily dry.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.